The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Community Church, casting brilliant patterns of red, blue and gold across the polished wooden pews. It was November 15th, a crisp autumn Sunday in the small town of Millbrook, where population signs proudly declared home to 8,047 friendly faces and a few old grouches. This was the kind of place where children rode their bikes without locks, neighbors borrowed cups of sugar without asking, and the biggest excitement usually came from high school football games and the annual Harvest Festival. Pastor Michael Thompson stood at the familiar oak pulpit that had served the congregation for over 60 years. His weathered hands resting on sermon notes he had spent the entire week preparing and revising. At 52, he had been the spiritual leader of this congregation for 12 years, guiding them through celebrations and sorrows, baptisms and funerals, Christmas pageants and Easter sunrise services. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, his black pastoral robe pressed to perfection, and his wire-rimmed glasses reflected the morning light streaming through the sanctuary windows. But this Sunday would be different from any other in his ministry. This Sunday, he would ask something of his congregation that would forever change how they understood forgiveness, judgment, and the true meaning of grace. The sanctuary was nearly full, with 200 faithful members settling into their familiar seats, with the predictable comfort of long-established routine. The Hendersons always claimed the third row left side, where they had sat since their wedding 43 years ago. The Martinez family occupied the back corner, where they could make a quick exit if baby Sophia became fussy during the service. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes sat in her traditional spot in the second pew, right side, where she had positioned herself every Sunday for the past 53 years, watching over the congregation like a benevolent guardian. The familiar sounds of a small-town church filled the air with comforting predictability. Whispered conversations about the week's events and local gossip, the rustle of bulletin pages as members checked the announcements, children's quiet giggles quickly shushed by attentive parents, and the soft, melodic notes of the organ prelude played by Mrs. Dorothy Chen, who had been the church pianist for nearly 3 decades and knew every hymn by heart. Among the congregation, tucked away in the very back pew near the exit doors, like someone ready to flee at the first sign of trouble, sat 34-year-old Sarah Mitchell and her 8-year-old daughter Emma. Sarah's auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed the premature lines around her green eyes, evidence of hardships that had aged her beyond her years. She wore a navy blue dress she had found at the Salvation Army store, clean and modest, carefully mended where a small tear had been expertly repaired with matching thread. Emma sat close to her mother, her legs swinging gently as they didn't quite reach the floor, her blonde curls catching the morning light as she colored quietly in a church activity book with a set of worn crayons that had seen better days. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her Bible, a leather-bound King James version she had purchased second-hand from a used bookstore. Its pages were already marked with highlighted verses about redemption, forgiveness, and second chances, verses she had read and reread during the darkest nights when sleep wouldn't come and doubt threatened to overwhelm her fragile faith. She had been coming to St. Matthew's for 3 months now, ever since she and Emma had moved to Millbrook in late August, desperately hoping to find peace and community after a troubled past that had left her feeling isolated, ashamed, and hungry for acceptance. The move to Millbrook hadn't been entirely voluntary. Sarah's previous life in the city had unraveled with devastating completeness when her addiction to prescription pain medication, which had started innocently enough after a serious car accident 2 years earlier, had spiraled into something much darker and more consuming than she could have ever imagined. What began as legitimate medical treatment had gradually transformed into physical dependency, And when the prescriptions ran out, she had made choices that still haunted her dreams and filled her with shame. She had lost her job as a medical receptionist when her addiction affected her performance. Then came the apartment, followed by her car, and finally the terrifying night when Child Protective Services had knocked on her door, threatening to remove Emma from her care. That night had been her rock bottom, the moment when she realized she had to choose between her addiction and her daughter, and thankfully, miraculously, she had chosen Emma. The 6 months she had spent in a state-funded rehabilitation program had been simultaneously the hardest and most transformative period of her life. She had been forced to confront not only her addiction, but the underlying pain, trauma, and self-worth issues that had made her vulnerable to dependency in the first place. When she emerged from treatment, clean and determined to rebuild her shattered life, she knew she needed to go somewhere completely new, somewhere her past couldn't follow her like a persistent shadow. Millbrook had seemed perfect when she discovered it online, small enough that rent was affordable on her new job as a waitress at Murphy's Diner on Main Street, big enough that it had decent schools for Emma and a small hospital for emergencies, and far enough from the city that the chances of running into anyone from her old life were virtually non-existent. What she hadn't counted on was how quickly news traveled in a small town, or how her carefully guarded past would eventually catch up with her despite her best efforts to keep it buried and forgotten. Most congregation members offered polite smiles and brief hellos when they encountered Sarah and Emma at the grocery store, the post office, or walking down Main Street on their way to school. But Sarah, who had developed an acute sensitivity to social undercurrents during her struggles with addiction and recovery, could easily sense the whispered conversations that followed her arrival each week, like ripples in still water. She noticed how animated discussions suddenly stopped when she approached groups of church members in the parking lot, how invitations to coffee dates or family dinners seemed to be extended freely to others, but never quite materialized for her and Emma. Sarah knew that in a town of fewer than 9,000 people, secrets were nearly impossible to keep indefinitely, and her history was becoming increasingly difficult to hide from those who claimed to follow Christ's teachings of love, acceptance, and forgiveness. She had overheard enough fragments of conversations in checkout lines and coffee shops to know that someone had recognized her from her previous life, and that carefully selected details of her past were being shared and embellished, with each telling spreading through the community like wildfire. The version of her story making the rounds bore little resemblance to the complex reality of medical addiction, personal trauma, and genuine recovery, but rather painted her in broad strokes as someone whose moral failures and poor choices made her fundamentally unworthy of full acceptance into their respectable faith community. She had become, without her knowledge or consent, a cautionary tale whispered among church members about the dangers of associating with those kinds of people. Despite the growing social isolation and the weight of unspoken judgment, Sarah continued attending St. Matthew's faithfully every Sunday because Emma absolutely loved the children's ministry program and because Pastor Thompson's sermons spoke to something deep and hungry in her soul, a longing for grace, acceptance, and belonging that she had carried since childhood. She held on to a fragile hope that eventually, somehow, the congregation would see past her mistakes to the woman she was becoming, the devoted mother she was determined to be, and the sincere faith she was working so hard to rebuild from the ashes of her former life. Pastor Thompson began his sermon that particular morning with an unusual heaviness in his voice that immediately caught the attention of even the most distracted congregation members. Instead of his typical warm greeting and cheerful community announcements about upcoming church events, he stood in contemplative silence for several long, uncomfortable moments, his eyes slowly and deliberately scanning the faces before him with an intensity that made people shift in their seats. The congregation, thoroughly accustomed to his predictable Sunday routine, began to murmur quietly among themselves as the silence stretched far beyond the bounds of normal pastoral pause. Children stopped fidgeting, adults stopped whispering, and even baby Sophia seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. When Pastor Thompson finally spoke, his words carried an intensity and gravity that commanded immediate attention throughout the sanctuary. He began not with his usual scripture reading or traditional greeting, but with a question that hung in the air like a challenge. What does it truly mean to be a Christian community? Not just in theory, not just in our mission statement, but in the daily reality of how we treat one another, especially those who need grace the most. He spoke about judgment with the passion of a man who had witnessed its destructive power firsthand, about the stones we cast at others while remaining willfully blind to the boulders of our own sins and shortcomings, about the dangerous and hypocritical difference between knowing Scripture intellectually and actually living it out in our daily interactions with broken, struggling people who desperately need to experience God's love through human kindness. His words grew more pointed and personal as he referenced specific biblical passages that many in the congregation knew by heart, but had perhaps never truly understood in their full implications. He spoke of the woman caught in adultery, dragged before Jesus by religious leaders more interested in making a point than showing mercy. He reminded them of Zacchaeus the tax collector, despised by his community, but welcomed into Jesus' inner circle. He recalled the Samaritan woman at the well, whose past should have disqualified her from God's grace according to the religious standards of her day, yet who became one of the first evangelists, sharing the good news with her entire village. These were stories of people whose pasts should have made them outcasts, whose mistakes should have permanently barred them from acceptance in respectable religious circles, yet who became central figures in Jesus' revolutionary ministry of redemption, forgiveness, and radical inclusion. Pastor Thompson's voice carried both deep disappointment and unwavering hope as he prepared to issue a challenge that would test the very foundation of their faith community's character and integrity. Then, in a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come, he set aside his carefully prepared notes entirely and spoke directly from his heart about a conversation he'd had during the previous week. A conversation that had challenged everything he thought he knew about his own congregation's capacity for genuine Christian love and acceptance. He revealed that someone in their immediate community had been facing cruel judgment and deliberate exclusion, not from the secular world that they often criticized for its lack of moral standards and Christian values, but from fellow believers who seemed to have forgotten that grace was meant for everyone, not just those whose sins were easier to hide, forgive, or understand. He spoke of whispered conversations in coffee shops, cold shoulders in grocery store aisles, and the kind of polite but distant treatment that wounded more deeply than outright hostility. The pastor's words grew even more direct and uncomfortable as he addressed what he called the elephant in the room that many have been discussing in parking lots and over dinner tables, but none have been willing to confront with the kind of Christian honesty and love that our faith demands. Why, he spoke about a woman in their community who had made serious mistakes, who had lived through experiences that some deemed unworthy of redemption, who had become the subject of gossip and judgment rather than the recipient of the Christian compassion and second chances they claimed to believe in. He talked about a single mother who was trying desperately to rebuild her life and provide stability for her child, only to find herself facing the same kind of religious exclusion that Jesus had consistently opposed throughout his ministry. Some congregation members began to look around nervously, exchanging knowing glances that confirmed their shared awareness of exactly whom their pastor was discussing. The Martinez family in the back corner shifted uncomfortably, while Mrs. Hayes sat straighter in her customary pew, her lips pressed into a thin line of what could have been disapproval, though whether her reaction was directed at the subject of the pastor's comments or at the pastor himself for bringing up such uncomfortable topics in the sanctuary remained unclear. The atmosphere in the church grew thick with tension as people began to understand that this wasn't going to be a comfortable, abstract sermon about forgiveness delivered safely from the pulpit, but a direct and personal challenge to their own actions, attitudes, and the ways they had failed to live up to the Christian principles they professed to believe in every Sunday morning. Pastor Thompson's voice carried both profound sorrow and unwavering determination as he continued, "I have watched as someone who desperately needs to experience the love of Christ through our community has been met instead with sideways glances, whispered conversations, and the kind of cold politeness that we mistake for Christian kindness, but which is actually a form of spiritual violence that drives people away from God rather than drawing them closer." The congregation was now completely silent, even the youngest children sensing that something significant and possibly life-changing was happening in their familiar sanctuary. Pastor Thompson paused, took a deep breath that seemed to gather strength from some deep well of conviction, and prepared to make a request that would be remembered and talked about by every person in that sanctuary for the rest of their lives. "I want to ask someone to stand up today," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly to every corner of the sanctuary, penetrating even the farthest reaches where Sarah and Emma sat in their back pew. "Not because I want to embarrass anyone, not because I want to put anyone on display like some kind of spectacle, but because I believe with all my heart that sometimes healing requires visibility, redemption requires community witness, and transformation happens when we have the courage to be seen as we truly are." He paused again, allowing the weight of anticipation to settle over the congregation like a heavy blanket of expectation and uncertainty. "Sarah Mitchell, would you please stand?" The request hit the sanctuary like a thunderbolt, sending a visible ripple of shock, surprise, and recognition through the congregation. Some members had suspected this moment might eventually come, while others were caught completely off guard by their pastor's bold and unprecedented move. Heads turned sharply, necks craned awkwardly, and barely audible gasps escaped from various pews as everyone frantically sought to locate Sarah in the suddenly electrified atmosphere. Sarah felt her heart stop beating for what seemed like an eternity as 200 pairs of eyes began searching for her in the back of the sanctuary. When their collective gaze finally found her, the weight of their attention felt absolutely crushing, like a physical force pressing down on her shoulders and making it difficult to breathe. Her daughter Emma looked up at her with growing confusion and concern, instinctively moving closer to her mother as she sensed the dramatic shift in the room's energy and atmosphere. For a moment that stretched into what felt like forever, time seemed completely suspended as Sarah struggled with an impossible choice that would determine not only her own future, but Emma's as well. Comply with the pastor's request and face whatever judgment, criticism, or rejection awaited her, or flee from the church entirely and abandon the small, fragile hope she had been carefully nurturing that she might somehow find acceptance and belonging in this community. Her mind raced through the potential consequences of either choice. Standing up would mean exposing herself completely, making herself vulnerable to the judgment of people whose opinions could affect her job, her housing, Emma's social acceptance at school, and their entire future in Millbrook. But running away would mean giving up on the possibility of redemption, community, and the kind of spiritual home that both she and Emma desperately needed. Her past was about to be laid bare before this congregation of people she had hoped might become her community, her support system, her spiritual family. The addiction that had started innocently with legitimate pain medication after a serious car accident, the poor choices that had followed as tolerance built and prescriptions ran out, the period of her life when she had made decisions that still filled her with shame and regret. All of it was about to be examined and judged by these people whose acceptance she craved, but whose rejection she feared even more. She knew that standing up might mean facing their collective judgment, their whispered conversations that would follow her through grocery stores and school events, their subtle but persistent exclusion from the community life she longed to be part of. But something powerful in Pastor Thompson's gentle yet firm tone, something in the way he had spoken about her, not as a problem to be solved or a scandal to be managed, but as a beloved child of God, deserving of love and acceptance, gave her the courage she desperately needed. With Emma's small, warm hand gripping hers tightly, providing an anchor of love and purpose that steadied her resolve, Sarah slowly rose to her feet. Her legs shook beneath her simple navy dress. Her heart pounded so violently she was certain everyone in the sanctuary could hear it. But she stood with as much dignity as she could muster, facing whatever would come next, with the quiet courage of a woman who had already survived her worst nightmare and emerged stronger on the other side. As Sarah stood there, visible and vulnerable before the entire congregation, the silence in the church became absolutely deafening. Every eye was fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed, every breath held in anticipation of what would happen next. Some faces in the congregation showed genuine curiosity and compassion. Others displayed obvious discomfort at having to confront the reality of her presence among them. And more than a few exhibited the kind of cold judgment and moral superiority that had driven her away from faith communities in the past. Pastor Thompson allowed the moment to settle deeply into the consciousness of every person present, letting the weight of Sarah's courage and vulnerability sink in before continuing with a voice that carried both unwavering conviction and deep pastoral compassion. He began to tell Sarah's story, not the distorted, incomplete version that had been whispered in coffee shops and circulated through social media, embellished with each telling and stripped of context and humanity, but the real, complete story of a woman who had fought her way back from the darkest places that life could take someone and emerged with her faith and determination intact. He spoke of her journey through addiction, carefully and compassionately, explaining how prescription medication dependence could happen to anyone, how quickly legitimate medical treatment could become physical dependency, and how the shame and stigma surrounding addiction often prevented people from seeking help until their lives had already begun to spiral out of control. He described her time in rehabilitation with respect and admiration, painting a picture of the grueling emotional and spiritual work that recovery required, the daily choice to fight for sobriety, not just for herself, but for her daughter, who needed her to be whole, present, and strong. He spoke of her determination to rebuild her life as a single mother in a world that offered few second chances to women with her history, her courage in starting over in a new place where no one knew her story, and her genuine desire to find God and community despite the shame that followed her like a persistent shadow. Pastor Thompson painted a vivid picture of Sarah's quiet strength, her commitment to her daughter, her faithful attendance at church despite the cold reception she had received, and her hope that somehow, some way, she might find acceptance among people who claimed to follow a Savior who had made a habit of welcoming outcasts, sinners, and the broken-hearted. The congregation listened in stunned silence as their pastor systematically dismantled their preconceived notions about worthiness, redemption, and what it really meant to be a community of grace. Some members began to shift uncomfortably in their seats as they recognized their own behavior and attitudes in his gentle but pointed critique of their response to Sarah's presence among them. With Sarah still standing, trembling but resolute, Her courage evident to everyone in the sanctuary, Pastor Thompson issued a challenge that cut straight to the heart of what Christian faith was supposed to look like when lived out in practical daily reality. "How many of you," he asked, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, with the authority of both pastoral office and moral conviction, "have shown this woman and her precious daughter the love of Christ since they began attending our church 3 months ago?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, made more powerful by its simplicity and undeniable truth. He continued relentlessly, "How many of you have invited their family to dinner, offered to help with childcare so Sarah could attend a recovery meeting or job interview, or simply had a meaningful conversation with Sarah about anything beyond polite church pleasantries? How many of you have asked about Emma's adjustment to her new school, offered to help Sarah navigate life in a new town, or simply treated them with the same warmth and inclusion you show to families whose histories are less complicated?" The silence grew even more oppressive as congregation members realized they were being called to account not for what they had done wrong, but for what they had failed to do right. The weight of their collective inaction pressed down on the sanctuary like a heavy blanket of conviction. Pastor Thompson's voice grew stronger and more passionate as he reminded them of Jesus' clear words about caring for the least, the lost, and the lonely, about seeking out the sheep that had wandered from the fold and needed the shepherd's gentle guidance back to safety and community. What happened next surprised everyone in the sanctuary, including Pastor Thompson himself, and would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, 78 years old and the undisputed matriarch of the congregation, slowly and deliberately rose from her seat in the second pew. Her arthritic hands gripped the wooden pew back for support as she stood, her silver hair perfectly styled despite her age, her face set with the kind of determination that had carried her through 7 decades of life's challenges. Without saying a single word, she began walking towards Sarah with measured but purposeful steps, despite her age and physical limitations. As she made her way down the aisle, her aged hands extended in a gesture that spoke unmistakably of embrace rather than judgment, other members of the congregation began to stand as well, creating a powerful visual testimony that grew more meaningful with each person who chose to join the movement. The first to follow Mrs. Hayes was Tom Rodriguez, a deacon in his 40s who had recently walked through his own family crisis when his teenage son had struggled with drug addiction. Tom understood intimately the shame, fear, isolation, and judgment that Sarah had experienced, and his standing was both an act of solidarity and recognition of their shared journey through the devastating impact that addiction could have on families. Then Maria Santos rose, a single mother of 3 who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet and understood the daily struggle of trying to provide stability and security for children while rebuilding a life that had been shattered by circumstances that often seemed beyond anyone's control. Her standing was an acknowledgement of the sisterhood of women who had faced impossible choices and somehow found the strength to keep fighting for their families. One by one, members of the congregation began to rise from their seats, creating a powerful visual testimony of support, acceptance, and community that grew more emotionally impactful with each person who chose to stand. The movement started slowly but gained unstoppable momentum as people realized this was their opportunity to choose love over judgment, grace over condemnation, inclusion over isolation, and community over comfortable exclusion. As nearly 2/3 of the congregation stood in solidarity with Sarah, the atmosphere in the sanctuary underwent a complete and miraculous transformation. What had begun as a moment of uncomfortable confrontation became a powerful demonstration of what Christian community could look like when it truly embraced the gospel message of forgiveness, acceptance, and radical, transformative love. Sarah, overwhelmed by the unexpected and unprecedented show of support, began to weep, not tears of shame, embarrassment, or defeat, but tears of relief, gratitude, hope, and joy that she had not dared to allow herself to feel in years. Her daughter Emma, sensing the dramatic shift in the room's energy and her mother's emotional release, stood beside her mother with newfound confidence and pride, no longer afraid of the judgment and exclusion that had kept their small family isolated and guarded. Pastor Thompson, his own eyes filled with tears as he witnessed his congregation demonstrate their capacity for growth, change, and genuine Christ-like love, realized that the sermon he had planned to preach had been preached through action rather than words, and its impact was far more powerful and lasting than any speech he could have delivered from the safety of the pulpit. The events of that transformative Sunday morning created ripples that extended far beyond the walls of St. Matthew's Community Church, changing not only Sarah and Emma's experience in Millbrook, but the entire congregation's understanding of what it meant to be a genuine community of faith in a broken world that desperately needed to witness authentic love in action. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah found herself surrounded by a support network she had never imagined possible. Dinner invitations began arriving regularly, not polite, obligatory invitations extended out of guilt or social pressure, but genuine offers of friendship, community, and belonging. Mrs. Hayes, despite her initial stern appearance, became one of Sarah's strongest advocates and closest friends. The elderly woman revealed a heart full of compassion and a lifetime of wisdom gained through her own quiet struggles and private sorrows that she had never shared publicly, but which had given her deep empathy for others who were fighting battles that couldn't be seen from the outside. Sarah's story became a testament to the truth that redemption is not just possible, but incredibly powerful when embraced by a community willing to see past someone's history to their potential for transformation, growth, and contribution to the larger human story of hope and healing. Months later, Sarah Mitchell would become one of the most active, beloved, and influential members of St. Matthew's Community Church, serving on committees, organizing community outreach programs, and eventually sharing her testimony with others who felt too broken, too damaged, or too far gone for God's love and human acceptance. The simple act of asking someone to stand had revealed the transformative power of visibility, vulnerability, and validation in the healing process, and had taught an entire congregation that sometimes the most profound and life-changing sermons are not preached from pulpits by trained ministers, but lived out in moments of courage when ordinary people choose to stand with those whom society would rather see remain seated in the shadows of shame, judgment, and isolation. Thank you for listening to this powerful story of redemption, grace, and the transformative power of authentic Christian community. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us what city or country you're listening from, and if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel for more inspiring true stories that remind us of the power of compassion, forgiveness, and second chances. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories that can change hearts and transform communities around the world, one person at a time.